Human history is filled with mysteries that are both interesting and shock us.
They would hang them out front so everybody would know.
Skeletons were often found with red hair.
You'll have thigh stacked up in places. You'll have skulls stacked in other places.
Shedding light on the diverse cultural traditions that have existed throughout the ages. One such practice that has captured our imagination is headhunting, a ceremonial act that was once carried out by various different ancient societies throughout the ages. For centuries, the act of taking the head was more than a mere act of violence. It was a rite of passage, a symbol of power, and a testament to a warrior's bravery. But behind the rituals lies a darker tale that's just as fascinating as it was brutal, where human lives were the ultimate trophies. In this video, we will cover the stories of ancient societies who were known to practice headhunting, some of them until relatively recent in history. If that sounds good to you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to History Leaks for more. In the modern world, the word Celtic evokes connotations of Ireland and Scotland, but the ancient Celts were a widespread group of people with origins in Central Europe. The ancient culture known as the Celts once extended far beyond the British Isles, with territory stretching from Spain to the Black Sea. The Celts were geographically the largest group of people to inhabit ancient Europe. The difficulty of tracing Celtic history is that none of these ancient peoples living in Western or Central Europe would have called themselves Celts. The name came from the Greeks, who made their first contact with this barbarian people they called the Keltoi in 540 BC on the southern coast of France. The ancient Celts were never a single kingdom or an empire, but a collection of hundreds of tribal chiefdoms with a shared culture and distinctive language. Since the Celts themselves left no written histories, were left to rely on biased accounts from their enemies, the Greeks, and later the Romans. Historians don't know exactly why the Greeks called them the Keltoi, but the name stuck and the Celts developed a reputation in Greece as hard-drinking, hard-fighting savages. Celtic warriors often fought in battle naked and were prized as mercenaries throughout the Mediterranean. The Romans called the Celts the Galli. They clashed with many Celtic tribes that invaded Roman outposts in northern Italy. Interestingly though, in modern Greek, the word for France is Gallia, very similar to the word that the ancient Romans used for the Celts. The Celts believed the head held the soul and was the most essential part of a person's body. Cutting off an enemy's head and taking it over was thought to give power over the spirit. In Celtic religion, heads were believed to have heavenly and protective powers. People thought that drinking from the skull of an ancestor could heal them. At Celtic shrines and churches, people worshipped carved stone heads. Celtic warriors would cut off the heads of their enemies after battle. As prizes, the chopped heads were nailed to walls or hung from horses' necks. Heads that had been preserved were sometimes kept in chests and shown off to guests as valuable items. As part of funeral traditions, heads were also taken from family members who had died. These heads were cleaned, put in a safe place, and kept at home. At events, some of them were even used to hold drinks. At many Celtic sites in Europe, life-sized sculptured stone heads of soldiers with or without beards have been found. These were worshipped at shrines. Even in the medieval ages, the Celtic Gaels of Ireland were still practicing headhunting. The tradition probably stopped having pagan religious reasons after people became Christians, but it went on for a while. When people in certain areas became Christian, pictures of Kephalor saints carrying their heads became popular. This shows that the Celtic cult and worship of the head was remembered and accepted long after it stopped being sacred. The Munduruku are an indigenous people living in the Amazon River basin, primarily in the modern country of Brazil. They are known for their distinctive culture and history of resistance against external threats and people encroaching on their territory. The Munduruku gained a reputation for being headhunters, particularly in the 18th century during their wars with the Portuguese. They would cut off the heads of their enemies, mummify them, impale them on stakes, and display them on the borders of their territory as a warning to others. In Munduruku towns, mummified heads were prominently displayed. They were often stuck on tall spears that were buried in the ground next to the warrior's hammock at night. Munduruku fighters were extremely proud, and their value as a warrior increased as they captured more and more enemy heads. The number of heads a man collected increased his status and chances of getting married. Heads were also swapped from one village to another. Although headhunting was abandoned over a century ago, the Munduruku still used the symbolic power of the image by painting mummified heads on notices they post along the demarcation trail. Today, the Munduruku are more focused on defending their lands and resisting government plans for destructive dam projects which threatens their traditional way of life, such as the São Luís do Tapajós hydroelectric dam. The Maori are an indigenous Polynesian people of New Zealand. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Maori first discovered and settled New Zealand sometime between 1250 and 1300 AD. They arrived in several waves of canoe voyages from East Polynesia, on deliberate voyages of discovery, navigating by ocean currents, the wind, and the stars. The Maori organized themselves into tribal groups, influenced by Polynesian practices, and they developed a robust warrior culture. Raids and conflicts brought up the practice of headhunting. In order to preserve the heads of their victims, the Maoris would smoke them after removing the skulls. In Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century, it became so popular to collect marked Maori heads that a lot of Maoris were killed just to supply this trade. When the Maori people of New Zealand got tattoos on their heads called moko, they carved the image into the skin and then rubbed ink into it. Moko tattoos were chiseled into the face. The face was carved to look like wood and then colored. The Maori warrior's tattoos would help him instill fear into his enemies. The tattoos also showed how brave the warrior was, proving that he can handle pain. Each moko tattoo had a unique pattern that was based on the person who wore it and showed their family tree and rank. Their victims' tattoos and other distinguishing traits would remain visible after they killed them, and these pickled heads would later be displayed as trophies. The Maori preserved the heads of some of their ancestors as well as certain enemies in a form known as mokomokai. They would remove the brain and the eyes and smoke the head, preserving the moko tattoos. Europeans thought these heads were interesting, and soon they began to trade them. The Maori soon began trading the heads of their enemies who were killed in battle for guns from the Europeans. But when there weren't enough heads to go around, men were killed for their tattoos. Slaves were sometimes marked so that their heads could be cut off and sold. In 1831, Governor Ralph Darling of New South Wales issued an order to outlaw headhunting trade in preserved Maori heads. This order was part of an effort to curb this inhumane trade that had developed between the Maori and European collectors. The order included a £40 fine for anyone violating it. although there is no record of any prosecutions or penalties being enforced under this order. In the Indian subcontinent, headhunting persisted among the Naga tribes of Konyaks in the northeast up until the 20th century. The most prominent Naga tribe, the Konyaks, come from a large group of people who moved from either Mongolia or southern China. But what sets them apart from the rest of the tribes in the area is their fierce headhunting history, which was part of their strong warrior tradition. Territorial conflicts between rival tribes and villages were resolved through warfare, and the Konyaks were feared for their headhunting skills. They beheaded their enemies and brought back severed heads as trophies in a specially designed basket that they carried into battle. The heads were then proudly displayed on the walls and doorways of the warriors. Naga fighters used to walk around the village with the heads of enemies they had killed attached to their top knots after a successful raid. It was tradition to honor the men with tattoos on their faces and chest as a mark of their heroic deeds. And the chieftain's wife was the one who would give them the tattoos. In celebration, women would offer rice wine, and older men would kill a water bull. The heads were then put on a flat stone outside the village chieftain's house, and the flesh and hair were boiled off of them. The Nagas' deliberate killing of people for their heads officially ended in 1935, not long before India got its independence in 1947. American Baptist missionaries who had gone to the region in the 1800s had a lot to do with the practice ending after they converted around 98% of the Naga to Christianity. The Indian government put a ban on headhunting in 1960, but Konyaks say that the tradition continued for a few more years before limited aspects of modernity were accessible in these remote parts of Nagaland. The more remote villages of Nagaland border Myanmar, where you can still find elderly former warriors with their faces tattooed and torsos bare. Now, most of them are in their 80s, and these former warriors are distinguishable also by their large ear piercings made from animal horn and war hats made from hunted wild pig horns. They still carry the knives with which they killed. Taiwan is a hilly island about 100 miles south of mainland China. It used to be called Ilha Formosa, which means beautiful island in Portuguese. The indigenous people of Taiwan were once spread all across the island. Today, they make up less than 2% of the modern population of Taiwan. Many of these ancient Taiwanese tribes used to practice tattooing as a form of art and headhunting against any invaders who unlawfully entered their territory. They were sometimes referred to as the mountain Aboriginal tribes, as they mainly lived in the hilly areas of Taiwan. These groups included the tribes Atayal, Bunun, and Pawan. The Han population of Taiwan, who are the descendants of Han Chinese people that moved to Taiwan mainly between the 17th and 19th centuries, were seen by the mountain tribes as invaders because they were from a foreign place and were moving into their land. Headhunting raids usually went after people who were alone and an easy target, like farmers working in the fields by themselves, or small groups of vulnerable people. The raiders would sneak up on these people and cut off their heads quickly before they could sound the alarm or protect themselves. After removing the heads of their victims, the raiders would quickly run back to their bases in the mountains. To avoid being caught, they would always move around at night. The headhunters would cut off the heads, boil them, and dry them. The skulls were kept as souvenirs, while the flesh and hair were discarded. It was a big deal to come back with a head because the group thought it would bring them luck. The Taiwanese Aboriginal raids for headhunting were intended to avoid direct battle with these bigger groups of often more organized settlers. The plan was to strike quickly, cut off the heads of a few people, and get away before the alarm went off and a bigger group could gather to challenge them. The mountain tribes were able to show off their power and take trophies while minimizing their deaths by using this hit-and-run guerrilla warfare tactic. After removing the heads of their victims, the Taiwanese raiders would carefully boil them to get the brain and flesh out. After the skulls were cleaned, they were generally hung from trees and put on shelves that were specially made just for them and called skull racks. This process preserved the heads, allowing the distinctive facial tattoos and features of their victims to stay visible. The raiders kept the dried heads as souvenirs and as signs of their bravery and success. The villages were very happy when a raiding group came back carrying the heads of enemies. The group thought that the trophies would bring them luck and wealth. Feasts and celebrations were held to welcome their warriors home. People sometimes hung the dried heads from the rafters of their longhouses or put them on show in the middle of the village. These Aboriginal groups in Taiwan thought that the severed heads held mana, a magical power or life force. It was felt that having the heads of enemies would give this power to the group that won. The Taiwanese Aboriginal groups stopped practicing headhunting in the 1930s due to harsh suppression and crackdown by the Japanese colonial government. As we can see, the practice of headhunting persisted around the world across many different cultures, from the Celts to India, all the way to New Zealand. Many of these cultures often share the same belief of the power and spiritual significance that one's head might hold, seeing it as the most important part of the human body that held the soul. Throughout the 19th and 20th century, headhunting has pretty much died out throughout the world. A lot of that thanks to the spread of monotheistic religions. But the Konyak tribe of Nagaland appears to be among the last remaining groups to have practiced headhunting, with some people saying that it ended in 1935 by the British colonial rule, while others claiming that it actually carried on all the way to the 1960s. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to History Leaks for more similar content, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.